introduce Chris Austin, a new board member of the Vashon Heritage Museum, who will now be introducing our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Elsa. Ann Irish grew up in Lakewood, Ohio, and has lived on Vashon Island since 1955. She earned a PhD in history at the University of Washington and taught at Vashon Island High School for 27 years, mainly government classes, but also algebra and Japanese. After retirement, she wrote 2 books, now published, on historical topics. Publication of a third, which deals with the history of the Puget Sound Islands, has been postponed due to COVID-19. Ann will be talking about how neighboring islands throughout the Puget Sound compare to Vashon. What makes the different islands unique and what is similar to all? We'll take a look at how the ferry service compares throughout the Sound. Did the location of the island's commercial centers affect the island's growth? And how does Vashon fit into the mix? And we'll also take a look at how COVID-19 might lead to changes in island life. Welcome, Dr. Irish, and you now have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Welcome to the islands, everybody. I hope you enjoy our trip. Oh dear, look here. It looks like we should be coming to an island, but obviously we're leaving if you see the wake behind the boat. But that's okay because we're just heading for a separate island from this island, and we'll talk about which islands they are at the end of the talk. There's 2 ways you can get to the islands. One of them is by ferry, which is exactly how I was on the trip on the picture you just saw. The other way is by bridge. And this particular bridge to Bainbridge Island takes you to the peninsula, takes you west from Bainbridge Island to the mainland that is also in Kitsap County. Where am I taking this picture? I'm on the Virginia 5, which Bainbridge Islands Historical Society uses every year for a round the island trip, just as the Vashon Maury Island Heritage Association uses it on Vashon most years. Well, here are the islands. They're all in yellow, but there's an awful lot of them that don't show on this map. There's many, 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 many small ones. How many are there all told? I can't tell you because it changes. It depends on whether the tide is high or the tide is low. But this tells you what some of the islands are from north to south. There's Lummi Island, excuse me, up near the east coast, not too far from Bellingham. San Juan Islands to their southwest. And then back on the east side of the Sound is Guaymas Island, not too large. South of Guaymas is Fidalgo. And it looks almost like Fidalgo is part of Whidbey Island, that long skinny island south of it. But really they are only connected by the Deception Pass Bridge. Next to Whidbey is Camino Island. And those 2 islands together make up Island County. And if you look across the Sound from the south end of Whidbey, you see 2 skinny little islands. One is Marrowstone and one is Indian. Now, a ways farther south is Bainbridge Island, and then you come to Vashon. South of Vashon are the South Sound Islands. They consist of Fox, McNeil, Anderson, Harstein, and very small Squaxin Island. Take a look at the areas of these different islands. Remembering the map we just looked at, it's not surprising that Whidbey is the largest, but did you realize it was that much larger than any of the others? That surprised me a little bit. And then there are a bunch of them which aren't too different in area. Vashon is number 6 there in the list, but you see we are somewhat larger than Bainbridge Island. Between Bainbridge and Harstein is quite a distance, and then the islands get small pretty quickly. Notice how small some of them in those top 25 are. This really surprised me when I first realized it. And now we have the island populations. Are you surprised that Whidbey Island leads in this category too? Well, I don't think it's it's the size that is responsible for this huge population. Instead, let's blame the Navy, because in 1941, the Navy built a huge naval base there, and the number of military and civilians who work there is what leads to that huge population. But Bainbridge Island is second. Now, why does Bainbridge have so many people? Compare it to Vashon Maury, which is number 5. Bainbridge has a lot more people than Vashon Maury does. I think the reason has to do with commuting. The ferry boat leaves downtown Seattle to come to Bainbridge Island, and it stops at Winslow, which is the center of population for all of Bainbridge. So it's fairly convenient for people from Bainbridge to go to downtown Seattle to work there, or to get a bus from there to anywhere in the city or even beyond the city. Is it that convenient for Vashon folks? No. We have to travel 5 miles from town to get to the ferry dock. And then if we're in a car, we have to travel quite a few miles to get to downtown. I think that's the reason, the large reason that Bainbridge has so many more people. Just as area did, the population size dwindles fairly quickly. Look how small the populations are for some of these islands. Okay, this chart is just for fun. You probably know that if you go to Orcas Island, there's a road up to the top of Mount Constitution, and you have beautiful views from the top of it. Note the 4th island, Fidalgo, also has a road up to the top of the island to Mount Erie, which is right in the middle of the island. Again, interesting views and different views from what you get from Orcas Island. There's also several islands I know of that have trails up to their highest point. Guaymas Island, number 7, is one, and Lummi Island, which is number 2, is another. So keep all those in mind. What about these other highest points? Well, where is the one on Vashon Maury, which is number 15 over on the right? I have no idea. Most of us don't, I think. And many of the islands don't have one obvious high point. So this chart is just interesting to look at, and that's about it. Let's look at the history of the islands for a little bit. This is going to be a very quick run through. And my main point about the history of the islands is that in general, I would say for most islanders, it's similar. It doesn't matter which island you're on. True, some people commute and some people don't. But if you don't commute, if you're on an island, your life may not be different from people on most of the other islands too. Now the Native Americans, this particular picture is taken at La Conner, looking across at Fidalgo Island, which is an Indian reservation for the Swinomish people. There's one other Indian reservation on an island, Little Squaxin Island, but nobody lives there because, well, the island is very small, and it turned out there was no water source on it. So the people basically soon left, and now they have a very nice headquarters with museum and library on the mainland not far away. And they keep the island as sort of a ceremonial headquarters. What did the Native Americans do historically? Their way of life? They were salmon fishermen. Of course, they got other foodstuffs too, but salmon was number one for their culture in many ways, I would say. And I would also say, again, that life was pretty similar. It didn't matter which island or part of the sound these people were on. Then the European Americans came, and what did they do? Well, among other things, they had to cut the trees down. You know that on most of these islands, there wasn't much land that was already clear, no prairie. And so if you're going to live there, if you claimed land from the government and were going to settle, you needed to make some room to build a house and maybe have a garden, etc. You needed to get rid of some of those huge trees. And there was all this wood here then. Well, entrepreneurs came and decided, okay, we're going to sell this wood. We're going to make boards out of it and make a lot of money. I would say that probably on every island that had many people living in the early days, there would be mills, small mills. But there were also 3 huge mills on the islands, 2 on Bainbridge Island, one at Port Madison, which is near the north end of the island, and this one at Port Blakely. If you go to those 2 places now, you'll see no sign at all except a little historic sign that tells you that anything was there that was industrial. But these places were huge. And Blakely's mill might actually have been the largest in the world. Now, there was another one. This was on Camino Island at Utsalati on the North Shore. But I maintain too that probably there were little mills on each island, certainly on Vashon. Well, what did you do with the wood after it was processed? Some of it was used here in Puget Sound, of course. People used the wood in their own property to heat their houses, to cook their food, to build their houses. And some of it they sold, of course. A lot of it went to California. Remember that the gold rush was in the 1850s, and the European Americans came to Puget Sound in the second half of the 19th century. So in those early years, there was a real need for lumber to build the cities, especially of San Francisco and Sacramento. And a lot of that lumber came from Puget Sound. Now, there were ships built in Puget Sound. Hall Brothers Shipyard on Bainbridge built sailing ships and then later steamers. And there were also small ship builders, boat builders, you might say, here and there on many of the other islands. So again, a way in which the islands were similar because people did the same things on different islands. Occasionally you would find one excuse me, enterprise that was particularly large or successful, but these enterprises were similar from island to island. And the same is true of this enterprise, fishing, especially for salmon. Anacortes on Fidalgo Island, just north of Whidbey, probably was the center of the salmon fishing industry. And as you can see, there used to be huge, huge numbers of fish that were caught there. Well, people didn't just cut down trees and make money that way. Agriculture became very important for the islands. And this was another pursuit that you would find on every island. Everybody had gardens. Well, most everybody, of course. And it wasn't just strawberries that were important. Let's say in the early 20th century, if you go to the San Juans, you would find tree fruit doing very well indeed. In fact, Orcas Island was famous for its pear trees that went all over the country in those years. Now that didn't last too long. One thing that happened was that central Washington got irrigated, and it turned out that you could grow and sell fruit cheaper there than you could from the islands, especially because the railroad went right through. Another thing that happened was World War I came along, and there was no longer any way to transport fruit off the islands. Ships were just not available. Well, going to the 1920s and 1930s, berries became more successful, especially the strawberry. And again, all over the islands, people grew strawberries. but the main islands where they were grown were Vashon and Bainbridge. And it was the Japanese American communities on these islands that were responsible for this crop doing so well. And that lasted until World War II. And as you probably know, the Japanese Americans were forced to leave home and go to government-run camps because the government wasn't sure that they would support the U.S. in that war. Well, the farms didn't mostly last real well because there weren't many people left to farm them. Everybody was off at the war or doing jobs in war work. And some Japanese Americans came back to the islands afterward, not all of them. But it turned out that the economy of the US had changed. And what was happening, among other things, was it became cheaper to grow strawberries on big farms in California and transport them by air now that frozen foods could be transported that way safely and easily. And that was the end of the strawberry industry on the islands. There's other industries. For example, limestone was available in the San Juans, especially on San Juan Island. And you've probably heard of Roach Harbor, which was famous for its lime kilns. And if you go now and take a look at it, it's a resort, but several of the kilns are quite visible and interesting to look at. Roach Harbor, let's see, I've got it down here somewhere. It lasted until the 1950s, actually. But in addition, there was this other lime kiln on San Juan Island that had started earlier than Roach Harbor and also ended earlier, about 1920. This is on the west coast of San Juan Island. It's a state park now, and people are given publicity about going there because this is supposedly the best place on land from which to see the whales cavorting in the water. Nobody talks about going there to see the lime kiln, but I think you should, because it's an interesting thing to look at. You can walk around it and get close to all sides of it, which you can't do at Roach Harbor. Well, in addition to industry, agriculture, other things were happening on the islands. And even before 1900, resorts were very popular. There were lots of them. In fact, I looked at a phone book at the library in San Juan Island for the year 1959, and it covered the whole San Juan archipelago, and it listed 17 resorts on Orcas Island for that year, would you believe? Resorts were found everywhere. Everywhere there was a beach to put one on, it seemed. But of course, whoop, I didn't mean to do that. Anyway, this particular resort on Maury Island at Luana Beach dates from 1924. Now let's move on. In addition to resorts, islands were used in another way, for defense purposes. Puget Sound seemed to be the kind of place that the government wanted to protect, partly because of defense industry that was here. The Navy Yard in Bremerton had been built shortly before the 20th century began. And so about that time, the Triangle of Fire was established. This was 3 forts built around the entrance to Puget Sound to protect anything that was on the sound that might need protection. Well, 2 of these forts were on islands, Fort Flagler on Marrowstone Island and Fort Casey on Whidbey Island. The 3rd, Fort Worden, is just north of Fort Townsend. They're very interesting places now. They're state parks, they make good visits. Lots of stuff is explained there, and they're scenic. And at Casey, you can see some of the big guns that were there, that were the reason the forts were there, because they could shoot the enemy's vessels out of the water was the hope. And of course, no enemy vessels ever came to these waters. And by the time we were involved in warfare, well, at the time they were built, it was about the time of the Spanish-American War. But as I say, Puget Sound wasn't involved. About 2 decades later came World War II, World War I. At the time, the US was involved from 1917 to 1918. Again, nobody came near Puget Sound. Also, by then, these poor forts weren't that useful because airplanes were now involved in military action. And the artillery in the forts were not created for that purpose. So the forts were used mostly for training from then on. Well, in other ways, the islands were important for the defense industry. And here's one example. This is North Whidbey Island, the town of Oak Harbor, which looks pretty small in this picture. If you looked at it today, it would look much, much different because there was many, many more buildings there. Also, the wharf that you see burned down in 1966, so it's no longer there. But what I want to point out is that wonderful sand spit. Isn't that beautiful? Well, the Navy removed it. They carted 900 feet of it away, would you believe? And again, it's the Naval Air Station that was built there. And if it's the Navy who built it, presumably they wanted to use the waters as well as the air. And so they wanted to make those waters the way they wanted. The military use of the islands had other effects too. And I'll go back to what happened to the Japanese Americans. The only large Japanese American communities on the islands were on Vashon and Bainbridge. Both these islands now commemorate their Japanese American communities. Vashon does at the Mukai House and Garden, and Bainbridge does at this memorial, which is built just above the location of the old ferry dock at Eagledale, from which the community was removed from the island. Well, that's just some of the aspects of history on the islands, and I don't know that I've done a very good job of convincing you that people live pretty much similarly on all the different islands. I emphasized ways in which they were different, but I hope you got the idea that, yeah, islands are islands, and they're all nice places. We happen to live on a nice one if we live on Vashon, but if you live on Orcas or Fidalgo or Bainbridge or any of the other islands, they're pretty nice places too. Well, let's look at 2 other topics in a little more detail. One is the location of the island's commercial centers. And the reason we're doing this is because here's a way in which Vashon is different from the other islands. On all the other islands, the commercial center, that is, if the island is big enough to have one, is on the shore. Why? Well, that's where people came to live when they first came to the island, is the obvious answer. And you can look on the locations here. Every one is on the coast of the island. There are several things to mention. Notice that there's no star on Harstein Island in the far southwest. That's because there aren't very many people living on the island. And why is that? I think it's just that there was no reason to live there in particular because there's not a large population center anywhere in the vicinity. The closest one is the city of Shelton, and it's 15 miles away. So Harstein is a nice island that just doesn't have too many people on it. so it's pleasant to be there. The other islands, as I say, the centers of population and commerce were all on the shore, but one other one should be mentioned, and that's Camino Island. Because if you look where that star is, it's not even on the island, it's on the mainland. Because when people settled Camino Island, they didn't build a commercial center. They used the one that already existed on the mainland shore, the city of Stanwood. In fact, to this day, high school students on Camino Island go to school in Stanwood in another county, not even in their own county. This is the historic commercial center for Camino Island. In recent years, in the north part of the island around Jerry's Corner, a commercial center of sorts has developed. You'll see if you go there. You might also look at Whidbey Island to notice that there are 3 different commercial centers there. Well, that's not surprising because the island is so large. And here they are, Oak Harbor, Coupeville, and Langley. Langley at the south, Coupeville in the center, and Oak Harbor at the north. This is just to show you what the Navy did. Take a look at 1940. They were all pretty much the same in terms of population. But then what happened? Look at what the Navy did to the northern part of the island. On the other hand, Coupeville and Langley have not grown too big. And these days, you wouldn't look at them as important commercial centers at all. They're very nice places. You should visit, especially if you haven't been there. They're historic. They emphasize the way towns used to be in many ways. But if you're looking for the big hardware store, for example, that's not where you're going to find it. Large enterprises tend to be more closer to the main highway or other places on Whidbey. I've got some pictures of island population centers that are on the shore. They're not really new pictures, but that doesn't matter because we're talking about history as well as today. Here's Friday Harbor, which is the center for all of the San Juan Islands. In fact, not just San Juan Island itself. And I mentioned Fidalgo Island as having a large population. Well, entrepreneurs decided that they wanted to build a city at this location, which became Anacortes, because they thought that it would be the best place for a terminus of a northern transcontinental railroad. And that never happened, of course, but lots of business came to the city. And of course, in early years, all those trees and all that fish helped keep it going for a good long time. So if you want a city that looks like an old-time 19th century city, you find it in Anacortes, the only place anywhere like that on the islands. Then there's Vashon. Does this look like Vashon to you? Here we are, here's town, looking north, just from just south of the main intersection. At the far left, you see the pharmacy. And if you look on down the street, you see the hardware store when it was a hardware store and not a restaurant. I remember when Vashon looked like this. And it is still the same place that it is now. Here's a picture that shows why Vashon Island, an inland location, became the main city on Vashon. What am I talking about? The fact that there was only one other place that on the island that rivaled it in population, and that was Burton. In the early years of settlement, in fact, Burton, which is on the water farther south from Vashon, did have more people. But over the years, this changed, and there's 2 reasons. One is the location of Vashon. You see that highway heading north to the ferry dock? Well, would you believe that both ferry docks were built at about the same time, about 1920? One difference was, however, that in 1920, the road from Vashon Town to the north end was paved, became the only paved road on the island. Whereas to get from Burton to the south end ferry dock, even though there was a dock there, it was a really roundabout route. And the road we take today didn't get there for some years later. The other thing you see here is look how much room there is for this town to expand. Now this picture shows some of the fields that grew berries and other things. It does not show the two large supermarkets we have today or the two large hardware stores. But expansion is very definitely possible in this location. Was it possible in Burton? No. I don't have a picture of Burton here, but if you go down there, you'll notice if you're on the main highway that if you look on one side, there's water, and on the other side, there's a big hill. It's not very good for building a town. You do have the peninsula, and can you picture the peninsula full of industry or possibly residences? It just never happened. Vashon became the larger town, and part of the reason was that the two cities that were nearby grew the way they did. Vashon is oriented towards Seattle, and Seattle began outpacing Tacoma, which Burton was oriented toward. So Vashon helped Vashon become larger than Burton. I don't know if these were the reasons that Vashon outstripped Burton and that Vashon became our main community. I don't know for sure, but those are some ideas. This map shows where people settled in the early days. And the docks were located in those areas. That's why people settled there. If you're going to Burton, you go up that long Quartermaster Harbor into the south end of the island, and you see Burton located right by that little peninsula. Now, Vashon Town is shown by this largest of the squares, somewhat farther north, and you can see that there is a harbor not very far away, Vashon Landing. However, if you try to get from Vashon Landing up to Vashon, it's mighty steep. Horses could pull wagons or buggies easily. Well, I guess fairly easily. I tried walking up from the last place I could leave my car easily, and it really was steep, but it was doable. Bainbridge also, on this particular computer, doesn't show very well. I hope it does on yours. But this is just to show you that Bainbridge too, like Vashon, in the early days, had settlement just on the beaches, just on the shore. And that's where everybody lived. And in many ways, that's still where a lot of people live today. And finally, here's one more picture of the center of population and commerce. This one is Bainbridge, and you can see the ferry dock there at Winslow, which is the center of population. However, it doesn't look like this anymore. This doesn't look like a very old picture. It's a postcard, but since the time this was made, Winslow has expanded considerably. You'll find many apartment buildings and condominiums in the area that help lead to that huge population we saw Bainbridge Island have. Well, let's move on to one more topic, and that's the ferry system. Let's start with a pre-ferry timetable. This is the Virginia 3, which was run by the same company that eventually ran Virginia 5. The schedule was similar. This went up the West Passage of Vashon, just like the Virginia 5 later did. And it went all the way from Liza Beulah to Seattle at the time of this particular schedule. The times changed. We've got ferry boats. You remember this cartoon Eddie Froning drew for the Loop a few years ago? He's a Vashon guy. He went to Vashon High School. And I think he came up with what many of us who use the ferries think, my gosh, does it cost that much? You know, look at what it cost when I first came to the island and what has happened over the years. But anyway, we still take the ferries. And here's the ferry boat. Is this one of ours? It looks sort of like a baby Washington State ferry, doesn't it? Actually, this one runs to Anderson Island from the mainland town of Steilacoom in Pierce County, and Pierce County runs this ferry system that goes to serve Anderson Island. It's a nice little boat. And now here's the Washington State Ferries island. And I wanted to show this picture because Lopez Island has the same kind of route from the ferries to the population on the island as Vashon does. The ferry dock is at the far north end, right around the corner of that close peninsula. And so if you take the ferry to Lopez, you get off the boat, your car climbs the hill to the top of the hill. Takes a while, just like it does at the north end of Vashon. And then you travel for a while along this peninsula that doesn't have too much going on, doesn't have a lot of fields and so on and so forth. And finally, you come out to the main part of the island, just as you do on Vashon. But the rest of the ride, the ferry ride to Lopez is quite different. It's a different ferry schedule. I've put together some charts showing what Washington State Ferries does in serving islands. Now, this does not include places like Bremerton because that's not on an island. And here are the island pieces of information. If you look at the bottom of the chart, look how long it takes to get to any of the San Juan Islands from the mainland. Well, I call it the mainland. It's the place from which you go to the San Juan Islands, even though Anacortes happens to be on an island itself. Fidalgo Island, it just has a bridge to get you there. Well, it takes a good long time to ride the ferry from Anacortes to any of the San Juans. Whereas the ride to Vashon from Fauntleroy is short, as is the ride from Mukilteo to Clinton. This is the route from the mainland north of Seattle to South Whidbey Island. Clinton is the town at the terminus on Whidbey. Well, how many trips can you take on the ferry every day? I did this before the COVID came and changed everything for us. This was a winter schedule. And if you look at a summer schedule at that time, you would find more trips to the San Juans, and that Port Townsend to Coupeville run, which is the one that takes you to the west coast of Whidbey Island, would have more trips because they bring a second boat to the run just for the summers. Notice that Bainbridge doesn't have as many runs as Vashon does. That is the north end Vashon. Bainbridge does have a larger boat, however. And the run that has most of the trips is the one that goes to South Whidbey Island. Well, here's a picture of the ferry arriving at Bainbridge Island. I'm waiting to board it to go back to Seattle. And the folks you see on the car deck are all ones with bikes or motorcycles. If you're a foot passenger, you don't have to go onto the car deck. You have boarding that goes directly to the upstairs deck. Which ferry docks have overhead boarding for foot passengers? that can be pretty important. And not everybody, not all the docks have it. Vashon and Fauntleroy do not. Seattle and Bainbridge do. And Bainbridge has so many foot passengers that you'll see if you go to Bainbridge or that Seattle terminal. It's very important for them to have it. There's two reasons it's a good idea. One is it's safer. Nobody's going to get hurt. And if we lived on Vashon back in 1974, I'm sure will remember hearing about the horrific accident there was one day at Fauntleroy when a woman somehow got her car going and it went over the chalk holding the wheel down and it plowed into 4 pedestrians walking off the boat. Several of them had broken bones, and a young fellow who went to the high school was dragged 30 feet by that car, and he had head injuries and was in critical condition for a while, did recover, but oh gosh, how frightening that was. And if the foot passengers don't have to board where the cars do, you're not going to have anything like that happen. The other advantage of overhead boarding for foot passengers is that it means that cars and people can board and disembark at the same time. So it saves a lot of money. And that would, darn it, I'm getting tired, I guess. It saves a lot of time. And that would be useful for the Vashon run. But we don't have it. And we probably won't ever have overhead loading because it's expensive to build. You would have to build an elevator at each place. And we don't have that many foot passengers. But there's one other advantage that some of the runs have that we don't have. How many ferry slips are there at each terminal? We've got 2 at Vashon, but only 1 over at Fauntleroy in Seattle. We don't need more than 1 on the south end runs. Seattle has 2 or more, in fact, because they also serve the city of Bremerton. And there's an extra one at Bainbridge. And Mukilteo, where the brand new terminal has been built, only has 1, but they've arranged this terminal so they can build another one if they ever need to. They don't need it now. They have just 2 boats, and 1 boat will leave Mukilteo when the other boat leaves Clinton, and they'll meet in the middle of the runs and get to the other dock, and they'll never be there at the same time. So they don't really need 2 slips. Does Vashon need 2 slips at Fauntleroy? Wouldn't it be nice if we had them? Back before COVID-19, I went to Seattle fairly often, and I would catch the 9 o'clock boat, partly because the bus went straight from the boat downtown. And I swear, every time I was on that boat, we had to sit out in the water for a while and wait for the previous boat to get out of the Fauntleroy dock. And if we had a second slip, that wouldn't happen. That is one improvement that I would really like to see the ferry system do for Vashon. It may never happen because it too would cost money, but also for political reasons, because the folks in West Seattle don't want it. They'd like to get rid of us. Actually, they're nice to Vashon folks, but they don't like what the ferry system does to the traffic there. And you can't blame them in a way for that. So that is my description of what the ferry system is like for the various islands that depend upon it these days. Is ours the most complicated system? Well, we have 3 different terminals in our system, but look what you've got in the San Juan Islands. Imagine having to work that schedule out and which ships go where, when, and so on and so forth. That would be mighty complicated. And if you ever go to Friday Harbor, be careful when you leave because you've got to get in the right lane to make sure you get to whatever destination you're heading for. And here's our newest ferry boat that serves Vashon Island. It's the Chetzemoka, which serves the South End Run. Finally, you know, these days we're dealing with COVID-19, and I've wondered, are we going to get back to the same kind of life we had in a year or so ago after we all get the vaccine? Well, we don't know. But what's going to happen to our islands? We found that so many people are able to work from home instead of commuting. Will this continue? Will this continue? Will it bring more people to the islands? What'll happen? And I've also wondered, maybe some of the people who live on the islands close to the city, that is Vashon and Bainbridge, will some of our folks decide, I don't have to commute. I can work from home. I can move to the San Juans and live where there's more land and fewer people. Do you suppose that'll happen? We'll just have to wait and see. Well, do you have any questions? Elsa, it's your turn. I guess it's not Elsa.
Sure. There she is.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you, Anne. That was a great talk. We do have a couple questions. I mean, we have questions that have been going back and forth and have been partially answered. Let me see. Do you have any information on the submarine observation posts that were said to exist on the west side of Vashon during World War II?
Submarine posts? No.
Mhm.
No.
And I think Bruce may have answered that question with the same type of answer. Let's see. He says, this was Richard saying, I had heard submarines, but perhaps it was in fact for aircraft. I live about 2/3 of the way up slope from Cove, and the east slope of our place was very old, oddly shaped foundation that I wondered about. So maybe it was aircraft. Any aircraft observation areas?
Yes, there were aircraft observation areas on a number of islands, and 3 of them on Vashon. One was at Cove, one was near the main middle of the island, and one on Maury. I'd have to go back and check that, but we had 3 of them.
Oh, okay.
Aircraft, not for submarines.
Not for submarines. That'd be fun though. Let's see, Anne, what, tell us about the impact of the passenger-only ferry. And is Vashon the only island with passenger-only service? And what does Anne think is the best island to live on?
Well, yes, I think we are the only island with passenger-only service in a public system. However, if you go to the San Juans and think about the islands that people live on that don't have public ferry service, they have passenger vessels. And there's one island between Whidbey and the mainland that has their own passenger boat just for people. So there's a few of those. What changes has it brought to Vashon? I think more people who can commute directly to downtown Seattle like to use it. It probably did bring more population. Is that good or bad? I don't know. It's harder to find a place to park up near the ferry dock, I can tell you that. Well, what do I think about the islands? Which would be the best one to live on? Well, of course, Vashon. And but I've gone to all the ones that are served by Washington State Ferries and a few others. And whenever I get to another island, I think, oh, gee, this is nice. You know, This is, gosh, wouldn't it be nice to stay here for longer? I don't know. I think there's so many places that are nice that it's just hard to decide. One of the places that I didn't talk about that I really like is Eby Prairie on the middle of Whidbey Island. I think because it's a different kind of world. It's the only large natural prairie. It's a beautiful place, and it's been preserved by the government uh, to illustrate the way land was farmed and still is farmed in that way. It's just beautiful. But I also like to live on Vashon. This is home. I have no regrets about coming to Vashon many years ago. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
I think so. One comment was about, my screen is moving around here. Hold on, sorry. Let's see, about the island's growth. Another reason for our growth and development would be the Beale greenhouse and the K2 factory.
Oh, yeah. And I could have, in fact, when I was preparing this, both of those were on the list of things to talk about, but I was up to an hour and I was told 40 minutes.
Sorry about that, Ann.
Didn't get mentioned, but yeah, that's true. K2 was quite an industry, and I talked about early industries, but K2 is an example of an industry that for a temporary time was quite recent and huge as far as Vashon was considered.
Great. So Anne, someone wants to know, how long have you lived on the island, and what was it like when you first lived here?
Okay, 1955 was when we came, so that's been more than 60 years. And we raised our kids here. It's still the same place, but you know, it didn't have the extent, the arts and crafts to anywhere near the extent that it did now. More people were, I don't want to say farmers or just the kind of people who do whatever jobs they do wherever you live. I remember different stores in Vashon. I would take my kids to the local shoe store on Vashon Island, which I loved having. And the fellow who ran it mended shoes also, which was great when you have kids who, you know, are hard on shoes. Yeah, it's changed. Of course it's changed, but it's the same place.
Okay. So Anne, you have greetings from Japan, from Kyoko.
Yes.
Okay. And she said, thank you, Anne, and the organizers. Thank you, Kyoto, for tuning in. And Kyoto's looking forward to attending our next talk.
And she has been here, by the way. She has visited us here on Vashon, so
Good.
she remembers it.
So we have a question. How many islands besides Vashon had Nike sites?
Oh gosh, you know, that's an interesting one. Was it just Bainbridge? I think it might have been just Bainbridge, but
And maybe would be?
I don't remember like they did.
Okay.
There may have been other Nike sites around Seattle that weren't on islands.
Okay.
I'd have to check. And look on the computer, look up on Google, just look Nike sites around Seattle and see what you find.
Hey, here's a question. Do you have any comments on our brickyards and how they related to Seattle and Tacoma?
Yes, this was something else that you found on many islands, by the way, not just Vashon. Fox supplied a lot of bricks too, and they were used to build what became the downtowns of places like Seattle and Tacoma. Yes, definitely.
And are any of the island counties, are any of the islands counties by themselves, or are they all connected to mainland counties?
No, two of them are counties all by themselves. San Juan County of the San Juans, and Island County, which is Whidbey and Camino. But imagine living on Camino Island and having to go to Coopville, Whidbey Island for your county business, because it's a long drive around. You have to go all the way up to Deception Pass and around. And there have been attempts to have boat service between the two. Well, that doesn't pay. And there is a county office on Camino, and they do a lot of the work there. But still, if Camino people are going to be jurors, say, on a local trial, they would have to go to Coopville.
Mhm.
Um,
So here's another question. When was the earliest commercial gravel pit and where?
oh,
And then
God.
and where to, and where, so where did it go to? Did it go to Tacoma? Where'd they take the gravel?
That's a good question. Bruce Hallman, where are you? You probably know this. I don't happen to know the answer.
I'll ask him to unmute. Are there any other questions?
Ann,
Hey,
can you hear
Bru-
me?
Yes.
Yep, yeah, the earliest gravel pit on Vashon was Corbin Beach, actually. And that when it closed, it moved over to the west side of Maury Island and started that whole what became Pembroke and ultimately Glacier. So interestingly, the first gravel pit on Vashon on the water was at Corbin Beach. There were earlier gravel pits on the mainland inside the island that were used for roads and that kind of thing, but the first sort of water-based gravel pit was at Corbin Beach.
And where did it haul to? Where did it go to?
Well, it's like the brickyards. I mean, they were on the water because gravel and bricks were heavy to move and much easier to move by water than by land, particularly before there were roads and before there were automobiles and trucks. So bricks were made all over Puget Sound, anywhere where there was a clay bank, and the same thing with gravel. Anywhere there was a gravel bank, they could easily be washed down and then put on a barge and moved. So it went all over the Sound.
Thank you, Bruce.
You're welcome.
So can you tell us how Blake Island came to be used as it is today?
Oh, okay. That's an interesting story. For a long time, there was nothing much on Blake Island. The Native Americans had used it, of course. A family bought it and had a very nice house there. And I believe it was 1929 when the matriarch of the family died and the rest of the family left. And the house was empty then and burned down some years later. And many years after that, a couple of boys who went, I think, to South Kitsap High School confessed to having gone to the island, gone into the house, started a fire in the fireplace, thought they'd put it out. But it was that night that the house burned down, so they were probably responsible for it. But this was many years later, they said, and I don't think anything happened. Well, so how did Blake Island get to what it is today? There were various attempts suggested for commercial enterprises to buy Blake Island and do exciting things with it. You know, build all kinds of fancy resorts and this and that and the other thing. And a number of people thought, no, we don't want it, don't think it should be developed in that way. Eventually, the state was able to buy it, pretty much all of it, maybe all of it. And this was about the time of the World's Fair in Seattle. And gosh, what's his name? It escapes me now. He lived on Vashon. Decided it'd be nice to have a Native American exhibit on the island. And by golly, he created it. The idea was to have it open for the fair. And I think they missed that by a year. but it led to what they have on the island today. I just wish those trips to the island for people to visit the presentation would last longer, because it's such a beautiful island. It would be nice if one had a chance to walk around the whole thing while you're there, but not have to run back to get your boat back to Seattle. Hewitt, that was his name, Bill Hewitt. Yes, it's a nice presentation. The one they have now is not the original presentation. The one they have now is more authentic to the way the Native Americans in this part of the Sound, or well, let's just say in the Sound, lived, rather than as the ones farther north did, which was apparently in the first presentations that they had.
Well, thank you, Anne. We're 7 minutes after the hour, and I don't see any more questions. There are a lot of thank yous to you for the presentation. And thank you very much, everyone. We look forward to seeing everybody next month with our next presentation. And everybody stay safe.
Well, I wish I could see all of you folks too. We'll be through with COVID-19 one of these months maybe, and we can all get together again.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Okay.